the recording. All right. Let me get started. All right. Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. We are going through this series on Dao De Jing. Dao De Jing. Yes, that's better. Okay. So we are on number 13. So as always, we'll start by reading our translations, and then we're going to discuss each of them. We're going to try to cover 13 and 14. If not, we'll just cover 13. All right, so we'll start with 13. Who would like to read their translation first? Go ahead and type exclamation mark if you'd like to read your translation. Okay, we're going to start with Joe, followed by Dave. Joe.
This is the Wayne Dyer translation. Favor and disgrace seem alarming. High status greatly afflicts your person. Why are favor and disgrace alarming? Seeking favor is degrading, alarming when it is gotten, alarming when it is lost. Why does high status greatly afflict your person? The reason we have a lot of trouble is that we have selves. If we had no selves, what trouble would we have? Man's true self is eternal, yet he thinks, I am this body and will soon die. If we have no body, what calamities can we have? One who sees himself as everything is fit to be guardian of the world. One who loves himself as everyone is fit to be teacher of the world.
Wonderful, thank you. Next up is Dave.
Evening, everyone. This is the Henrik's translation I've been using. Chapter 13, regard favor and disgrace with alarm. Respect great distress as you do your own person. What do I mean when I say regard favor and disgrace with alarm? Favor is inferior. If you get it, be alarmed. If you lose it, be alarmed. This is what I mean when I say regard favor and disgrace with alarm. What do I mean when I say respect great distress as you do your own person? The reason why I have great distress is that I have a body. If I had no body, what distress would I have? Therefore, to one who values acting for himself over acting on behalf of the world, you can entrust the world, and to one who in being parsimonious, it regards his person as equal to the world, you can turn over the world.
Thank you, Dave. Next up is Brian, followed by David. Brian.
Okay, tonight's reading is from the translator by J.H. MacDonald. Success is as dangerous as failure, and we're often our own worst enemy. What does it mean that success is as dangerous as failure? He who is superior is also someone's subordinate. Receiving favor and losing it both cause alarm. That is what is meant by success is as dangerous as failure. What does it mean that we are often our own worst enemy? The reason I have an enemy is because I have a self. If I no longer had a self, I would no longer have an enemy. Love the whole world as if it were yourself. Then you will truly care for all things.
Thank you, Brian. Next up is David, followed by Evanique. David.
Okay, this is the Herman Uhl translation again. So glory and disgrace are both related to fear. Fortune and misfortune are both bound up with the body. What is meant by the saying that glory and disgrace are both related to fear? The one is high, the other is low. If you achieve glory, you fear to lose it. If you are in disgrace, you fear the shame of it. Thus, glory and disgrace both involve fear. What is meant by the saying that fortune and misfortune are bound up with the body? Fortune and misfortune come to us because we have a body. If we had no body, how should fortune or misfortune befall us? Therefore, he who is willing to give the world as much care as he gives to his own body is worthy to govern the world. He who gives the world as much love as he gives to his own body may be trusted with the ruling of the world.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. I want to read out the commentary from Ursula Le Guin about this. She says, Lao Tzu, a mystic, demystifies political power. Autocracy and oligarchy foster the belief that power is gained magically and retained by sacrifice, and that powerful people are genuinely superior to the powerless. Lao Tzu does not see political power as magic. He sees rightful power as earned and wrongful power as usurped. He does not see power as virtue, but as the result of virtue. The democracies are founded on that view. He sees sacrifice of self or others as a corruption of power, and power as available to anybody who follows the way. This is a radically subversive attitude. No wonder anarchists and Taoists make good friends. Next up is Evanique.
So mine comes from God as Nature Sees God, a Christian reading. Success is often as unsettling as failure. The world's troubles are no more important than the well-being of your own body. Why do I say success is often as unsettling as failure? Success strikes us deep. It shakes us up to get it. It shakes us up to lose it. Thus, success is really little different than failure. Both are unsettling. Why do I say the world's greatest troubles are no more important than the well-being of your own body? The reason I think I have troubles is because I have material existence. If I had no body, what troubles could I possibly have? What we must do is to see the whole world as ourself. Only then will we be worthy of being entrusted with the world. Only one who values the world as his own body can truly rely on the world in return.
Thank you, Evanique. Next up is Madeline.
This is from the translation by Jiafu Feng in Jane English. Accept disgrace willingly. Accept misfortune as the human condition. What do you mean by accept disgrace willingly? Accept being unimportant. Do not be concerned with loss or gain. This is called accepting disgrace willingly. What do you mean by accept misfortune as the human condition? Misfortune comes from having a body. Without a body, how could there be misfortune? Surrender yourself humbly, then you can be trusted to care for all things. Love the world as your own self, then you can truly care for all things.
Wonderful. Thank you, Madeline. Jason, would you like to go next?
Yes. Can I share my screen for a while?
Please do.
Armand is here, and I work with Armand. For one, I would say this one is a very challenging one, and I search, and then a Chinese scholar has been discussing this one for 1,000 years, and then I think if I like show this one, you will see this word. The problem is here. Okay, this word called "shen" again means body, or means self, or means your life. So if you, I also listen to a few translation. The problem here is at the beginning, I put in the red, these words ask you to abandon or have no body or no self. But at the last two, I highlight as blue. Lao Tzu asks us to love our body, value our body, appreciate our body as the world. So it kind of like, you know, opposite, right? So that's the challenge have been many years. So I'm going to read my translation, and then I think the red one and the blue one means two different aspects of self. One is your physical self. One is your, you can call disembodied self, okay, or higher level of self, or you call it spiritual self. So I'm going to read my translation. Treat fame and shame with fear, but appreciate the calamities within our own body. This one means physical body. What is the meaning of treating fame and shame with fear? Fame is worthless. We should be fearful whether we gain or lose fame. This is called treating fame and shame with fear. What is the meaning of appreciating calamity within our own bodies? Our physical bodies are the source of our calamities. There can be no calamities if we do not have our physical bodies. Therefore, one who devotes his spirit, which means disembodied self, to the world, appreciate that it can be entrusted to the world. One who devotes to his spirit or disembodied self to the world, love it, and can be a servant to the world. Okay. The reason I put this one, the body or self, in the two different aspects. If you remember on the chapter, I think in chapter 7, Lao Tzu, the Dao De Jing, talk about staying behind to lead staying behind the group to lead the group. Okay, detach yourself from the world to survive. Okay, in the original Chinese, the text including the same word body. Okay, 4 times. That means literally means stay. Put your body behind the group so your body can be lead the group. Detach your body so your body can survive. So why you stay behind and you can be in front? That means 2 aspects of body. One is physical body, stay behind, but your spirit is ahead of the group. So I think they have many places in the later part we will find out. Because this kind of 2 aspects of body, of self, okay, in most of the time, they are in the same way, but sometimes they are working in a different way. So I decided to put this one in a little bit different. So I hope it makes sense. If it doesn't make sense to you, that's not my fault, because Chinese scholar has been discussed for over 1,000 years and still debated. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jason. All right, let's see. So we have talked. Everybody has, okay, Amon, go ahead.
Your video's off.
Oh yeah, Shikant, your video, there we go. I just wanted to chime in because I'm glad Jason made it. It's good to see you. And this was a fun chapter to go back and forth on, because it does revolve around that notion of Ching, the idea of self and what's being discussed there. And it's a very interesting choice, because there are other terms in Chinese that can be selected to mean something like spirit or your soul or something more ethereal, but he's very deliberately, Lao Tzu very deliberately keeps using this version, which is almost paradoxical in the loss of self, the worthless self, and the worthful self, the not so embodied self. It's it is something that, like Jason said, Chinese scholars have tangled with this for years, but it
Okay.
creates.
Sorry, I'm a little bit earlier. I was just
Uh-oh.
here. Okay, sure.
Just a second. Okay.
That's all right.
Sorry about that.
No, that's all right. Yeah, I just wanted to say I appreciate the work Jason did with this, because it is a monster of a verse to try and tackle and encapsulate as well as he did. So hats off to you. I think you did a great job, Jason.
Wonderful. So let me ask both Jason and Amon a couple of questions about translation. So what is this experience like doing the translation? Jason first.
Yeah, I like to say that it's okay. Before I think it's a fun, because since I know the one, I read it when I was a kid, and then it's a piece of cake, So I just do whatever you guys read the translation, and I can do whatever I want. But later on, I find out, I can write it beautifully, like everybody do it, okay? But they will be very far away from the text. So I decide to get close with the text. And then I think I add more and more rule for myself. So I want to make sure it's consistent, logically sound, and then so become more and more difficult. So for example, like this one, chapter 13, it probably take me long time, and I even have to read the paper in Chinese to figure out what they mean. So turn out it's I would say, and Amon give me a lot of help, because when I do this one, because I know Amon is stay behind me, so I don't have to worry my English. I just have to write whatever I think is right, and he will come back for a better grammarly correct. And since he know Dao De Jing a lot, so he also have the inside information. Yeah, that's my experience.
Nale,谢谢你. No, I appreciate that. And as I said before, Jason does the heavy lifting because he's doing the initial translation. I just get to go through and proofread with grammar and, offer up some insights or some ideas. And he said he makes more rules for himself. So when we're going back and forth, he's telling me if I see the Chinese word and I can use, and that's the word that's used in Chinese, I want to find a word that I can consistently use that fits it. So with Shang, we looked at this idea of self and these two different contexts where I said, well, instead of body and spirit, then why don't we talk about an embodied self and a disembodied self? Because it captures the same idea, but it sticks with the rule that you were applying. And I was tickled to see the disembodied self in there as, trying to wrestle with this very, very challenging text that you can spend a lifetime plumbing its depths. And doing a deep dive like this has just been, wonderful. I've had a blast. I'm sorry you're sweating so much ink and tears, Jason.
No, actually, I find out through the translation, it forced me to understand much deeper, So I appreciate this opportunity because when I look at it, I find out they have a lot of things I never pay attention. Because one of the reasons is I typically as a parent, I'm against memorizing things. Because if you too quick memorize, you probably not think it. So the translation will force me to unpack what I think I understand to make it not understand. And then, I think that's helpful.
Wonderful. Thank you, gentlemen. Really appreciate this. Next, we are going to move to our thoughts on number 13. Next up is Phil. Phil, go ahead.
Thank you, Jason, for what you said in terms of body. In one sense, I didn't need your translation because I was already there in a funny way, because there was a lot of emphasis on the body, and there was an emphasis on also being human. And my
my thought is it went slightly beyond what you said. It's like, because the Tao cannot be known, you can only reach for it. Therefore, this embodied self, I would prefer to remain it as the spirit. The spirit is the body reaching for the unknown. So in that sense, it's sort of somewhat detached, I suppose, but it's never detached from the body itself, because it suffers, it has joys, whatever it is. And I think it has also empathy to others who are human, because they have bodies. And it's because of that existence of the body that we exist in a temporal sense. And that, in a sense, a temporal sense is reaching for the atemporal, the eternal, the infinite. So in that sense, there's always a gap. And so therefore, in a sense, all you could do is, as you would call it, leave from behind, so that in a sense, the people come to know it. So, but it never really abandons the body. So it is quite in danger of being, if you don't attach it to the body, it's in danger of being transcendental, rather just merely reaching for the infinite. And I think there's too many things that indicate that he was not about being transcendental. So in that sense, yes, I agree with you, except for I really do believe that it is really the body as embodied in the spirit is reaching for this eternal understanding, but it's only reaching for it, it never knows it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Phil. Always great comments. Next up is Joe, followed by Madeline. Joe.
Yeah, when this is a kind of a very, very challenging one to analyze, because when I was looking at it, initially it just come off to me as something where I thought that it was looking at how to separate our egos from opinions, essentially. And for the version that I was reading anyway, and what happens is that when we seek the approval of opinions of others or the external world, that there is a certain amount of anxiety that comes with that. That there is a so if you're seeking favor is degrading, alarming when it is gotten, alarming when it is lost. So that there's this anxiety that is built up when you're seeking something like approval from everyone else, and it actually takes you away from the Tao. It takes you away from the state of nature. And in addition to that, you're also, once you get praise, you're seeking more praise. And I look at that as as someone that is looking for power. Where you're actually you're more becoming more power hungry than living in accordance with nature. So it allows us to really focus on becoming in touch with ourselves. And that's what I see as the essence of the poem. And I've read a couple different versions here, so it's not that this is the only version that I'm going off of. Also, the one thing is the Tao is eternal, and in this particular translation, I am this body and will soon die. That makes it finite. So you're not living through the Tao if you're looking at it through the finite. And the truth is, the self to me is kind of undefinable. So there's that aspect of it as well. Those are my initial thoughts. I think about it in more practical terms. The very first one of these meetings that we were talking about, I think it was Joss Waitzkin, and he was talking about how the Tao has helped him and how he played chess and how he had become he's a prodigy who was a chess prodigy, and he became very popular And essentially, he started to say that his ego started to grow and that he was playing outside of the self. He was playing, he said, I'm from across the room, than rather than playing within the self. And to me, that was a really interesting way to look at it, because once you become detached from the self, then you're detached from who you are and what you're doing. And I think that and it takes away from your ability to actually do whatever you're doing. That's, it was an interesting example I thought about from the video that you posted about. We had a meetup on that, I don't know how long ago, but it was, the introduction to the Dao. So anyway, those are my comments.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Next up is Madeline, Evanique, and Dave. Madeline.
Thank you, Jason and Aman. This was really great because I had always just read, the translation that I have, and I was surprised when I started hearing different versions of body and self in the different translations. So that was going to be my first question, and that was the one you addressed. Thank you. I thought it was very interesting that Lao Tzu had chosen to use an ambiguous term. And it seems that this is really the first time in reading this book together that we have come across this the sense of dichotomy between body and self that's so prevalent in the West, and that is so gives people this yearning to leave their bodies, to transcend, to upload into computers, to go to heaven, whatever it is, but some way to get out of the body. And there is a wonderful poem by Andrew Marvell. I'll put the title of it in the chat. It's about the dialogue between the body and the soul. And it alternates verses, and each one is complaining vehemently about being dragged around by the other one and being subjected to the pains of the other one. And I would be perfectly happy if it weren't for you. Thanks.
Thank you. Next up is Jason. Jason, go ahead.
Yeah, just I quickly respond to what Madeline talked about. She talked about the Lao Tzu choose the ambiguity words like a son, the body, which means have a different meaning. I have been thinking about this one for a while. That's why I'm looking for the evidence why he doing this. And I'm reading the Heidegger's and talking about death. And Heidegger used the word, death is considered as Dasein's death as considered the possibility of the absolute impossibility of Dasein. Okay, so he also used this kind of word, and that's not, they have the reason that I start to figure out, because our daily conversation, we just take the word self, body too lightly. So every word have their multi-dimension. So this philosopher, they try to figure out, tell us we should go beyond what language is. So I think that's really, I still very vague understanding, but I have been thinking about this since I translate this chapter. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Next up is Evanique.
Yeah, when I think of this chapter, I think of connection, and I think of success and failure. That's at the beginning of the poem, and I think of it as a connection with each other. Like you can't have success without failure. A lot of times people try to avoid failure, which is why they aren't as successful as they choose to be. Some very real world examples is Jeff Bezos and Amazon. He was broke for the first 10 years that he started Amazon. He was operating in the red. And then all of a sudden he had, well, not all of a sudden, but through failure after failure, he learned and got better. So I think they're connected. I was going to say too, the body and the spirit. I think Madeline was talking about this. They're connected. Like in the Bible, it talks about Jesus being 100% divine and 100% human being. And what it means is that, you know, the body is the house of the soul. And so to me, when he talks about it in the Tao, it's the body and the soul coming together as one. So I see it all as connection, and the world and the self, the same thing, connection. You know, he's like, if you think of the world as yourself, is when you're truly ready to lead the world. And I think of it like, if protected the world like we protected ourselves, if we thought about it that way, that we're connected to the world, I think we would treat this earth as a better place. And I think a lot of natural religions, like Native American religions, really believe in this concept of connecting the world to the self and the self to the world, and that they're connected and it's all one. And even when your body expires, it goes back into the earth, and it's connected back to the earth. So I just see connection throughout this whole piece.
Wonderful, Evanique. I want to build on that, the connection between self and the world. I'm going to just read out the final verse of 6 different translations, okay, to see if we can get a pattern on this, just self and the world. First one, surrender yourself humbly, then you can be trusted to care for all things. Love the world as your own self, then you can truly take care of all things. See the world as yourself. It's the second translation. See the world as yourself. Have faith in the way things are. Love the world as yourself, then you can care for all things. So one who values the self as the world can be given the world. One who loves the self as the world can be entrusted with the world. Love the whole world as if it were yourself, then you will truly care for all things. So people who set their bodily good before the public good could be entrusted with the commonwealth, and people who treated the body politic as gently as their own body would be worthy to govern the commonwealth. Therefore, only one who values the world as oneself is fit to tend the world. Only one who loves the world as oneself can be entrusted with the care of the world. So these are 6 different translations of the same last paragraph. Next up is going to be Dave, Zach, David, and Katie. Dave.
Yeah, thanks, Shrikant. I have maybe a too picky question, but in my translation, you might have recalled I had the word parsimonious in the next to last line, and it really puzzles me because in most of these translations, we're using mostly pretty common words, you know, the earth and soul and wind and things. And so I was curious, I don't know if Jason can help or someone that can identify the characters, because, you know, I obviously can't identify what character they're taking this meaning from, but I'm curious if there's some particular word, reason someone had translated the character to such an unusual word. Parsimonious, normally I think synonyms would be like thrifty or even cheap, but let me read the last 3 lines if that will help. You can entrust the world, and to one who in being parsimonious regards his person as equal to the world, you can turn over the world. Jason, any idea about that?
Well, I read a few translation, and I also read a lot of Chinese translation, and the turnout I cannot. Well, most of them are translated beautifully. Okay, they're good lesson, but the problem is this: they either not loyal to the original text, okay, or they logically violate, because at the beginning, the book tells us if you have no body, you have no disaster, no calamity. So they ask us to forget about your body. But the book asks us to love your body as the world. Love the world. So this one is logically wrong, right? So that's the problem, has been discussing for many times. So Dave, for your translation, I believe the translator tried to make the logical right. That's why they abandoned the original word. So that's my understanding. And that's not only happen in English translation, also happen in the modern Chinese translation, because most translators just write down whatever they think logically right, or just write something makes sense by assuming people are not going to dig into the original text. So that's the only thing. Aman probably have something else to say. He understand English better, but
Aman, what do you think? Sorry, Jason. Please start.
No, my hand went up almost immediately, and I couldn't help but smile, David, when you read that translation, because as I had said to Jason earlier in another chapter, I had offered the word parsimonious, and he's like, "What is with this word?" It has long been my favorite choice of terms when talking about way, action, no action, the idea of parsimonious action, being, stingy or, miserly with the amount of effort you use, which is not the same as saying do nothing, even though that is the common way is often sometimes translated. But to refer to it as parsimonious action has always been a great way, to my mind, to translate it. I don't think that way was in that text at that point, but I think that translator probably pulled from the same concept.
I think that's the part I probably have some disagree with Armand on this part, the Wu Wei and parsimony. I think there's a difference, but I think we will figure out later. If you give us another 10, 20 weeks, we probably have a better answer. But I think we still struggling on this. There's a lot of basic terms we need to figure out. I mean, myself, Armand, and everybody, because I see this process is learning for myself, because a lot of things I don't know. And when after meeting this group, I look at the original text and look at the Chinese translation, I find out they all wrong. So, I'm not satisfied with most of that. So that's why I started working for myself.
Yeah, thanks for the comments. It's such an unusual word, but I appreciate Ammon. To him, it's meaningful and common to him, but I recognize the word. But it was, to me, just so unusual to have that word thrown in there. But thank you very much. It was quite interesting.
Thank you. No, it's a very interesting word, not the least because it's such a long word to talk about, being very short and to the point, but it does it very effectively. So it's a very, very interesting word. Thank you. Next up is going to be, let's see, am I missing somebody? Next up is going to be Zach, David, Katie. Zach.
Thank you, Shrikant, and thank you, everyone. So I basically see this chapter as kind of helping us zoom out our perspective. So I think it touches on how having a body and perceiving the world from it, quote unquote, like through our eyes and through our senses, it very much can, I think, give us the illusion that we're separate from others and from the rest of the world, and kind of promote this idea that there's a me that I need to protect and I need to build up and I need to make better than others. So we kind of start competing and comparing. We want to succeed. We don't want to fail. We want to be better than others and not worse than others. And either way we go, we end up kind of creating this anxiety for ourselves and this sort of sense of enmity with other people. because we can't both be the best and we can't both not be the worst, things like that. And I think, especially towards the end, it points to the fact that if we see others in the world as integral to ourselves, which I think Evan, you kind of touched on as well, is just a more holistic view of reality, because we're not entirely self-sustaining. We need other people, and we need the environment to be functioning in certain ways and to be healthy in order for us to be healthy. So I think if we shift our perspective in that way, we naturally start to seek out win-win situations, both for ourselves and for the environment and for the people around us. Just seeing that everything is working in tandem, everything is part of this whole, everything is, what's the word? Interdependent. And that we're not a separate entity, even though it might appear that we are from our perspectives. That's pretty much
Wonderful.
it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Zach. Next up is going to be David.
Yes, thanks, Shrikant. A few things. I mean, one is, I mean, the early part of this chapter, I was curious that I mean, how specific it was, in the sense that it seems to be talking a lot about balance. I mean, that these two extremes, and that, you know, both the high and the low cause the same emotion, and whether this was meant to be, you know, just this specific example, or meant to be sort of a generalization that many different extremes, and just that one should try to have this central, you know, balanced approach to life. And also later on, I was really curious, as people have been talking about those last two sentences about care. And one is about, you know, the focus, everybody says, of again balancing self-care, to care for oneself as well as care for the world. And the last sentence actually reminded me a lot of Jordan Peterson and some of his comments, specifically about, you know, that first you should, you know, fix yourself, fix your family, fix your village, and work on it. And then when you have fixed your local situation, then you're worthy of trying to, you know, to create a revolution, to fix the world or whatever. And so that sort of resonated with me, or at least it evoked that same sort of feeling in these last sentences, at least the translation old, where he's saying, you know, that he was willing to care about himself, is worthy to govern the world. He was willing to love his own body, maybe trusted with ruling the world. So I sort of saw an echo from what I've seen with Peterson, that, you know, he who is able to care for himself and care in the local and fix the local, then is worthy to bring that knowledge and experience to the world, as opposed to people who want to, you know, start out, I'll fix everybody else before I fix myself. It seemed to be saying, or at least thought, to fix oneself, and then if one is, you know, cares for oneself, is willing to give the world as much, then one is worthy to help fix the world.
Thank you, David. I mean, I was reading through these 4 paragraphs again, and interesting, I noticed something very interesting. First 3 paragraphs is about fear, whether it is fear of how other people view you, or the fear of the body, you know, fear of what may happen to your body. And the last paragraph is about love of both yourself and the world. So I think that is the basic contrast that I see. We had this amazing dancer called Karen, who is making the point, it is never about yourself versus others. It is about kind of fear versus trust, or fear versus love. When you have fear of yourself, or looking at yourself, and fear of other people altogether. And when you have love of yourself and love of other people together. And that kind of goes together. Love goes together, whether it is self or others, and fear goes together, whether it is yourself and others. And I see similar theme, the first 3 paragraphs being about fear, and the last ones about love, the last paragraph about love. Next up is going to be Katie. Katie.
Yeah, I was enjoying this idea of selflessness in the last paragraph, thinking self-care. One of my favorite meetups that I went to was talking about extreme altruists, like people that will give their kidney to a random stranger without paying attention to like how they're related to them. So this paragraph got me thinking about them. They would be fitting this ideal of treating everybody like yourself. So I think it's interesting to apply this idea, this very idealistic idea, to treat others like you would treat yourself, and see how it would work in extreme circumstances. And also like that example too, because when you look at the media, you usually see crazy outliers. You don't see the people who are extremely generous.
Wonderful. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to give a chance for people who have not spoken to speak first, and then I'm going to cycle along with people who are going for the seconds. So the first one is going to be Kevin, Brian, and Laura. Kevin.
Thank you.
Kevin, could you speak into the mic?
Yes, it's not loud enough.
Yeah, now it is loud.
Okay. Yeah, I got a different angle to try to interpret this. The first, I would say, give this chapter the title, maybe don't fear about the fame or shame. This kind of, the whole chapter similar religion of the Buddhism used to. Body is formless, it's spiritual, it's achievable. And from, let's see, Western mathematics, we want a word is called trichotomy. So we use the number positive, negative, zero, magic zero. That's our supposed to be stay the person. So if let's see back to you, how to translate to our social practice. If let's see positive, we can individual. We're going to individualism. We're going to stay positive, individual. My effort contribute, pursue my own value. However, that's our lives limited, less 100 years average, right? Then another one is, let's in the middle, I call it self. If negative, let's see, why is sacrifice society, my family, for public good? That's from Western view. But let's see, for Eastern view, mostly we consider, if let's see family oriented, that's good virtue, good value. That's kind of trichotomy perspective understand. And also I can connect this chapter to our super chapter number 1, the Dao and the name. For example, you name the body, that's for yourself. That's mean the body is for myself. It's not internal. What's external is not yourself. So which means spiritual level. I'm going to pause here. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Next up is Brian, followed by Laura. Brian.
So I'd like to tie this in a bit with poem 9, in the end of poem 9. And here I'm focusing on relationship between the self, actions, and the consequences of actions. In poem 9, it states at the end, let go of the job when it's done, more or less. So that's talking about when the job is done, let it go. You know, whatever the consequences are is what the consequences are. The point of time it's focusing on is when the job is done. Here, I think in this one, we're focusing on not when a job is done, but when we're contemplating undertaking a task. So starting the job or thinking about how we might help with a task. I think from that perspective, these issues like failure and success, fame, all of these can be a diversion or a distraction. And that's what I think that poem 13 is inviting us to see, along with, there are other things, obviously, that people have been great in bringing that out. But that the self itself can be an enemy. The consequences of your action should not be measured by the impact on you or you alone, but by the impact on the larger group, on the world, and the rest. So that's where I think it says that ourselves are our own worst enemy. Leave the self out of it and focus on the broader picture, the world, and the consequences of your actions for the world. Leave the fame and shame behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Next up is going to be Jason, followed by Laura. Jason.
Thank you, Brian. I think you make a very good point on the chapter 9, because if I read the original text, chapter 9 also use the same word, okay, the sun, okay, body, self. So in chapter 9, that same word you can explain as your physical body retire or your spiritual retire. Okay, so that's the word has been used many places, and we will see the same word come out. And the English translation always translated in a different way, and usually you don't see the word. Yeah, just like mentioned.
Thank you, Jason. Laura, what do you think of chapter 13?
Wait a second, sorry. I have some difficulty with it, and so I was just looking, and I read, I went online, and there were 11 different translations of this, and incredibly different translations, such that which one is right? I mean, they're so diverse, and there has to be one that is sort of correct, I guess, if possible. I'd have to study them hard, and I think, is it necessary to sit and look at all of them and try and make sense of them in some way? But anyway, I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but one of the things that has appealed to me in reading these poems is the way that they're written. It's sort of like he begins and he takes you through to an end, There's some beauty in there. There's a beginning and an end. There's some closure at each point. And I always felt that, I don't know, it was very appealing to me. And in this poem, I don't get that. I feel it's abrupt and it's cold, and it just leaves me hanging. It doesn't have that same, I don't know the right word for it, but in terms of the poetic style is different, and it's disruptive to me. I don't know if I'm right or wrong in that, but I think it's just different and somewhat harsher, and I'm not sure that it. I don't know where it leaves me. I don't know where it leaves me. I don't know about the others, how they feel.
Thank you, Laura. Great observation. So I want to follow up on that, because you raised really two very fundamental points. One is about the structure of each of these poems. So let's take a moment to just reflect on that question. What do you folks think is the structure of each of these poems? Do you see a structure? Is there a build-up? Is there a beginning? Is there a way in which he ends? So any thoughts about the structure? So that's one. Jason, what do you think?
I always focus on the structure. That's always the first thing I look at, because that's my personal interest, because I have less interest on what he teaches us. I'm more interested in how he argues his point. So every chapter, I look at the structure. So for this one, basically the first line, okay, talk about the treatment and the shame with fear, appreciate calamity within our own body. This one should be in the quote, I think. See, the author take a common saying, okay, this sentence, and then he explained it. That's the second part. So what's the first part of the shame and what's that? Shame and the fame, and what's the calamity with your body? Okay, he explained it. After he explained, he give you a lesson. I think we will see it commonly. The author either take like last week we talked about, I believe that's a common song or poem. Okay, it happens. So he take that one and explain it and give you a lesson. Or he will look at the nature world. That's the sky, that's the one thing, and then explain it and give a lesson. I think that we will see this kind of pattern constantly happen. Not always, but usually it's this kind of logic.
Wonderful. So on this question, again, I want to raise it for anybody who wants to answer this question. I see a very distinct structure where he's trying to first show you things in nature. He's going to actually just show you, here is water. Here is what happens when the water is overflowing. Here is what happens to the body this way. Here is what happens. It's like showing you things. And it most of the times it is ending up with, what does it mean about how to function? What is the moral of the story? What is the way here? That is being pointed to by these various things that have been lined up. So that's the structure that I see. Amon, do you have any comments about the structure of the poems?
Yes, I certainly do. I just was enjoying listening to some of the conversation here. And I do think, Laura, actually, you have a point about the abrupt sort of turn that happens at this chapter. And I talked with Jason a little bit about this as I went on to read this, and then chapter 14 sort of right after it, and this whiplash sort of sensation of what's been going on. So I went back and I looked, and for the last 4 or 5 verses, the emphasis has been empty yourself, hollow yourself, don't overdo, rein it in, get less concerned with these, material trappings. And you get that again and again and again. And then here, there's a change where there is something very grounded about this, and there's something very earthy about this Shan that we're talking about, this self that is an embodied and this disembodied self, and how they are part of this world. And so it's almost, when I read that shame and blame are to be feared, or disgrace and grace are equally as calamitous, it's almost saying, all right, so you've been taking the lessons, you've been trying to empty yourself, you've been trying to become more ephemeral, more enlightened, more disattached from the world, now reattached to the world, because the world is where your concerns are needed. The world is where your actions count. And so if you are going to be entrusted with the world, or you are going to be worthy of the world, you have to love the world. And so there is sort of a tonal shift that happens right here. And then it's ruptured right again at the next verse, where it becomes very cosmic, very ethereal once again. And I think, Laura, that you might have been sort of picking up on that in your discomfort with this verse, but that's just my impression of it.
Thank you, Amon. Next up is going to be Sun Jung, followed by Kevin. Sun, what do you think? I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, by the way, so please correct me.
That's okay. Yeah, it was correct. The way how I saw it, it's, you said make an example with the nature, but also I always see the yin and yang side of it by contrast. And then, but the message is not looking at negativity or positivity. Look, the message is to see it as a whole thing. Then this chapter 13, especially, I think it's explaining about, for me, the message is the explaining impermanence. See things as it is, not as focused on like negative yin or yang. That's what I saw. And then apply that to small self individually, then apply to bigger self. That's the approach.
Thank you.
From that I saw.
Thank you. Kevin, what do you see in the structure?
The structure you like use, I would say, how induction. Normally, let's give you some concrete example. Everybody can feel it. Use water, use nature activity, and here is use a feeling like we can. Other than the sun, is use six times use body. Then the next is about Jing, which is worry or fear or surprise. surprise could be good surprise, could be a bad surprise. So then that's what we can use fear. You got wealthy, you lose about lost it. You don't have wealthy, you don't have money, you worry about what's in my future. You're going to always worry. If you don't think about yourself, your body, you all got happy life like a Buddha. So that's my interpretation. Thank you.
Thank you. Dave, what do you see in the structure of all these poems?
Well, I wanted to comment on one line that if you don't have a body, you don't have any trouble, more or less paraphrasing. And at first it comes across as sarcastic, but also I wonder if maybe the meaning is you need to be tolerant and accepting of your suffering. Is that maybe the correct interpretation?
Thank you. Thank you, Dave. Let me go to, let's see. Let me go to Phil. Now let's continue on this because we took a little bit of digression here to just look at the structure of the poem. Now let's continue with all the exclamation marks and all the raised hands. I'm going to now go in order. So we'll start with Phil, followed by Madeline. Phil.
Let me just say something quickly about the structure.
Please.
From what you guys are saying, it seems like the structure is a parable. You know, he starts with something, he concludes with a kind of lesson, but it is not stated, how should I say, in exact language, but it gives you a lesson. So that seems like an old format, which is not a criticism, right? It just seems like a format that people could understand a parable much more than a kind of straight analytical explanation or even a question and answer. So that's what I think. Now, let me get to my point. Yesterday, I have the fortune of meeting Friedrich Nietzsche, and it seems to relate to this. First, I thought about, I had certain criticism of Nietzsche, and I tried to soft pedal to him. The first thing I asked, well, he just said God is dead, and therefore, in a sense, man's responsibility is to create the universe through creativity. Okay, so good. So I asked him, like, that sounds a lot like Brahman and Shiva, you know, because we know the Vedic religions, well, I don't know it well enough, about interiority. I said, how come you left out Vishnu, who is the sustainer God, right? Because that seemed important to me. And he sort of beat around the bush. He never really answered the question, okay? Because what I thought was that if you look at interiority, I thought that Vishnu was, in a sense, the link between humanity and the divine. And it's interesting to me that Rama and Krishna were manifestations of Vishnu, not Brahman or Shiva. Okay, so he comes down in a different form, in a slightly more human form, and comes back and reports back to Vishnu. And it so seems to me sustaining has something to do with existing in temporal time, in which you could then make a decision when to activate the creative force and when do you activate the destructive force. And it seems important to have that the middle game, which humanity was. So he didn't latch onto that mild criticism because it was easy for him to dodge it. And then I asked later on, because he was talking about creativity, I said, well, that's good. That's reaching for the transcendent sphere. But it seems to me, humanity, if you're going to act like God, humanity also exists in the temporal time. That in a sense, it seems to me, you have to take account of how you have to equivocate as a human being, because human beings seem to be able to equivocate from the temporality a two-dimensional linear time and into a kind of more cosmic and infinite vertical time of harmony. And so so that was a slightly harsher criticism because I was actually in disguise accusing him of hubris.
Let me ask you one question. This is fascinating, but I want to connect it to Dao.
Yeah,
So
I am connecting it now.
Please. Yeah.
And it seems to me, when you look at Dao, the Dao, that's why I thought when I read the Dao, I said, oh, this fits right into what I was thinking. That in a sense, he made a really big point of the body existing. That's why I didn't want to go just to the spirit, but the spirit is moving. So that's about, because the Tao cannot be known. All you could do is hint at it or whatever you could do. You reach for it. And so I thought that was to retain the humanity that exists in existential time that has to do with the body and the physical existence, as well as the spiritual existence that reaches up to the thing. And I think that's why it was important for him to actually kept underscoring the body, because the body is the thing that institutes you in an existential time, but allows you to transcend it through the spirit in reaching for the eternal time. So that's what I mean. It's very important to understand that he is actually making the equivocation about the two, and that's why he never speaks directly about the Tao, because he knows that's unspeakable.
Wonderful. So let me ask you a very short question. Okay. How does Tao map to Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva? What is Tao?
I actually think the Tao is outside of the creation. But it connects in terms of, let's say, it connects probably best in relationship to Krishna.
Yes.
Who is a manifestation of existence, but somehow has a kind of flight toward the eternal and back.
Wonderful, wonderfully put. Okay, I cannot resist this. My name is Shrikant. Shri is the goddess of wealth, and Kant is husband. So I'm the husband of the goddess of wealth, which is another name for Vishnu. So I'm the one who has to keep things going. So that's so I have a very special relationship. You know, I have to live up to my name. So next up is going to be Madeline, followed by Joe. Madeline.
I have a couple of questions about word usage. Let's see, at the end of the poem, my translation talks about everything there is, and Jason had translated it as the world. I'm wondering if this is the 10,000 things or if this is some other meaning. And then my other question is whether the word meaning fear or surprise could be possibly translated as alarm.
Let me quickly answer your question. Two questions. Yeah. The word they use, I kind of keep it as a standard. Okay. Whenever they call 1,000 things, I translate as everything. Okay. So, and now this one called the 天下, that means under the sky. So I always translate as the world. That's why I put it as the world. Okay. And another thing I think Kevin also mentioned is about the treat fame and shame with fear, and then the same word, you know, exactly same word, you can translate as a surprise. So that means you get something good or you lost something, you treat as a surprise. That's exactly the same word, and I don't see either one is better or which one is wrong. I don't see any problem for either one, just the ambiguity of the Chinese word. I think both work.
Thank you, Jason. Next up is going to be Joe, followed by Elena. Joe.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things that have been said since I was thinking. But one thing I do want to just call out briefly is something that the Ursula Le Guin, when you were reading it, translation, or her interpretation actually, really was interesting, because it's a very Western approach and it's very stoic. And when she said that, what was it exactly? Power is the result of virtue, not virtue is power. Virtue isn't power. So that distinction is in it. And in a way, if you look at the structure of the poem, it shows that how virtue, you seek virtue, and then that affords you the responsibility to then to be able to govern. And I look at it as kind of like almost, it's almost it's a very Western approach to how we view, I think, Western philosophy, as far as it maps very nicely to Western philosophy and how we view virtue ethics today. So I just thought I would add that, because that's something that struck me as well. Anyway.
Thanks, Joe. Next up is Elena.
And thank you, Shrikant. I just thought two things appeared to me. One is it's looking at the verse 14, and let me just read the very end that I have here.
Oh, we're not going to verse 14 yet. We're on.
We're not. We're on the 13 only, right? Because I have a 14 on my calendar and I joined later. Okay, so we are not discussing 14.
We're still on 13. We're still on 13.
Okay, got it. So yeah, let's stay with the 13. And then my question is, in general, there is a so what it is, being subtle or being balanced or whatever else. It's just when we were discussing the word parsimonious, right? Like we normally don't use. It's whether stingy, whether what? Perhaps balanced, perhaps less emotionless, less emotional, and more and emotionless, perhaps. Maybe that's one of the meanings. So don't go into extremes. One of the things. And secondly, there is one thing that it's not in this chapter, but it's about, I think it's in the Bible or something like that, not being seduced by appearances. And it's what's being said is just, again, appearances could be extreme. So say, when your whatever sport you play, like support, cricket, soccer, you name it, football, right? When you willingly, unwillingly, you at the end go and experience emotions, and that is one of the ways to be seduced by appearances. So, what would be, anyone could share? How can you not be seduced by appearances and go into these extremes? And go back into the center, go back into the balance, because it's one of the conditions of achieving that.
Thank you. Thank you, Elena. If anybody wants to share, you can go ahead. But let's do one thing. I want to follow up on another. Actually, Laura asked two really great questions. One on the structure of the poems, and one on there are these 11 translations she found. Let's see, are we going to number 14? Maybe. I want to do a quick discussion, Jason, on, do you need to leave, Jason? You need to leave?
Yeah, I probably need to leave. So yeah.
Okay, how about this? Let's go ahead and have Jason's take on 14, and then we'll talk at some point. I want to raise the question now, and then we can talk about it a little bit later. The question is, how do you navigate all these translations? This is classical Chinese. Even when I talk to my Chinese friends, they say that they have to use multiple Chinese translations to figure out what is going on. Okay, so what method each of us is using to go through all these translations to try to get at the meaning? So that's what I would like to discuss. I don't know. Let's do one thing. Jason, how about this? We will not go to number 14. I promise to hold number 14 for you next time.
You don't have to hold, yes.
Okay.
Aman can do it, I think so.
Okay.
He has my translation, yeah.
Oh, he has your translation too? Okay.
We
Okay.
exchange your email, so he can. So if you ever goes 14, yeah.
Okay. Okay. Because I want to hit this the point about translations, about how people deal with translations, because I want to kind of, periodically kind of step back and look at things which go across what we are doing and how we are doing it. So
can I say something about
translation?
Yeah, I think the translation is, I think we have to set our own rule. Otherwise, it's go all over the place. So I sometimes I listen to many translations. I feel very jealous because I wish I don't have to look at the Chinese origin. Okay, so I can go as far as I can. So I think that's both ways help. You cannot just stick with the original text, and then you cannot just go too far. So I think in this environment, it's very healthy, at least for me. I look at the original and I listen to outside, because you look at the original, you limit my imagination. But it looks like everybody helped me to bring outside, and then I still look at the original. So, and even I think somebody asked about the standard translation. I just have to say, even in Chinese scholar, they always have a debate and a different kind of translation, because that's the original text writing in the ancient world. So I think that's probably the beauty of that. So
wonderful. So what I want to do is I want each of us to talk about how we are approaching translations. Okay, Jason has his way, and he has certain strengths, he has certain abilities, he has a long history, and so each of us has to use their own way. For example, the way I'm looking at translation, so I'm going to speak for myself, and I invite each of you to just speak for yourself about how are you navigating all these translations. So what I did was that I think that ultimately you're trying to understand the Dao. Okay, it is really between you and the Dao. Okay, Lao Tzu also is a translation. It's all interpretation. Everything is an interpretation, including what you're thinking. The real thing is the Dao. Okay, and you have to try to grasp the Dao. We are fortunate that we have somebody like Lao Tzu that kind of points in directions. Okay, the way in which and what an interpretation, a best interpretation would do is to say, look there in that direction, and then look at that. And then you kind of have to put things together. Okay, so I don't see that there is any option but that. So I see all translations as interpretations. And I'm trying to use all of them together to try to get at what Dao is. Okay, that's always my quest. Now, what I've found is that some translations speak to me better than others. So I have standardized on some translations, which give me the spine of approaching it. So for me, it is the Ursula Le translation. That's my favorite. That speaks to me best because she has a poetic flair. She grew up with the Dao, and she is part of the West. So she speaks to me better. And she has the poetic flair, because you kind of have to have that poetic flair in order to capture what is going on. So it speaks to me best. So I use that as a spine, as a starting point. Then I use that website, which has those 10 translations, and I flip through multiple translations. Some of them I don't like, so I don't use them, but I still like about 7 or 8 of them. And only 5 of them can fit on the screen. So for each of the poem that I'm reading, I flip through and see which are the best 5 I can find, okay? And then I read across. I try to compare them, not as saying, is this right or is that right? But what other points they are bringing in. And I'm trying to form a picture using the spine that I have with the main translation in order to fill it out. Maybe completely change the spine, move the spine in a different way, and maybe kind of build it out. So that's how I'm approaching things. And ultimately, I'm trying to put it in my own words not a literal translation, but saying, okay, what is being said here? Because you have to formulate things in a way that speak to you, which may not necessarily be a poem, but you're trying to understand what is being said and you're trying to say it in your own words. If you have the artistic capacity, you can draw it and try to do that. But it is through kind of expressing that. And I think this dialogue is fundamental to my understanding of the Tao, because what I find is that no matter how much work I do, when I come here and when other people talk about what they are getting out of it, each person is bringing their own context. And many, many times people fill out some of the holes, some of the things that I had not thought of. So I invariably leave with a much richer understanding of the poem that I came to with it. So that's the approach that I'm using to translations. So next up is going to be Kevin, Joe, and Dave. Kevin.
Yes, thank you. I'm not sure people notice almost every time we chapter by chapter, I post one keyword or two keyword with Kojak or radical. Recently find out that's obviously word, especially in Chinese words. It's a pictograph. You kind of look at it. It's very interesting, beautiful. We consider it's art. We people post it on the poster at a home wall. So I would say translation should be word by word level. Let's see directly, even if it didn't form a sentence, you know what it's going to do. Then phrase by phrase, then paragraph by paragraph. Then that's about the Dao and the name. So the first is what the Dao talk about. So for example, today, then Jason uses fame, shame. I would say I agree with. And also another one is use fortune, unfortune. I also agree with. One thing I would say a bunch of translators use success, failure as off the track for me. So that's like you said, it's the next level, we're going to move to translation. That interpretation. I agree with you. However, I would say the word, each individual word, that matters. If that's every chapter, I would say, let's say we start translation begin. We need, let's say, I'm a Chinese speaker. I would say try identify that word, the keyword meaning. Let's talk about that. I would say this words for us go like less confused, like Laura, notice that. Yeah, so different translation. Also, you from religion perspective, translation is different meaning. For example, just now I posed 天下. That's mean we use word. We generally use word these days. Modern days use word. Anything word 2,500 years ago, I use word. I don't. Then, however, we normally agree with use heaven. So that's for me. I personally am not agree. Also use Dao, we use translate heaven. Then D, we use the translate to earth or ground, soil. That's so for Dao. If you translate to heaven, that's different. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Next up is Joe, followed by Phil. Joe.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, because when I started doing this, I took a different approach. I was looking at 4 separate translations, and I was limiting myself to 4 because I didn't want to get caught up in, trying to, read. There's so many different translations out there. I wanted to kind of just get the essence of a few of them. And I thought 4 would be a good number. However, after listening to everyone here and hearing everybody read theirs, I expanded that to around 7 to 8. And the reason I did that is because you can get enough consistency between the 7 and 8 that I'm reading. And I'm starting to get an understanding to, some of the common themes of those 7 and 8 that it's helping me, it's providing me with a framework for really kind of looking at it from multiple perspectives, in the sense of looking at it from both the Western point of view, but also the East, like an Eastern point of view. And I think I'm seeing some patterns in there. But the truth be told, I think that you have to go through this multiple iteration. Like, this is something that you would do over and over and over again. It's one of the few things that I'm actually keeping very, very good notes on when I'm going through this, because I look at going through this, doing 8 more in a year from now. So that, I mean, that's the way I'm viewing this, is much more long-term than just saying, that this is going to be my one way of doing it. But that's the approach that I'm taking. It has expanded, and I try and look at different, from both, again, Eastern translations and Western translations. But that's my approach.
Excellent. Thank you, Joe. That was very helpful. So it's going to be Phil. Phil, how are you approaching translations?
Well, first of all, I'm an artist, so I respect my own interpretation quite a lot, because I feel like I have a feeling for certain things. But I also know that I have different levels of understanding. And I kind of use more of a musical metaphor, because I'm not a musician, but I listen to quite a lot of music. And for instance, I love Mozart. And you get to a point where you respect the interpreters because they have something to say. And you get to a point when you get more and more sophisticated, you are fine-tuning that you could actually say, oh no, this is actually closer to what the meaning of the thing is. So I'm not only including my creativity, but I also respect other creativities, not all of them, but enough that I listen to it, particularly if I'm a beginner. As a beginner, I used to think, well, they all sound pretty much the same. And then I realized, no, they're very different. And then you begin to be whatever. As an example, I mean, I love Leonard Bernstein, but I always thought of him as more of a Beethoven interpreter, right? But when I heard him play Mozart Piano Concerto number 15, it was marvelous. It was incredible. That I said, wow, this really captures something that I didn't quite understand with some other interpretation, which I respected very highly as well. So therefore, in a sense, you always have to also expand your understanding. There are a lot of other people come in to your interpretation and say, oh yeah, okay, that adds a whole nother dimension to it. So the reason I listened to Lynn Bernstein was actually back in 1969, I knew because I knew that Mozart conducted the concerto of from the piano, and I actually wrote to George Zell, who I knew played the piano quite well, and I asked him to interpret Mozart from the piano as well as conducting it, but unfortunately he had died at that time. So I've been always searching for somebody who would conduct the orchestra at the same time. So I ran into Bernstein. I said, well, there's going to be very different, but even the way he interpreted, it wasn't even the way he played the keys, which is a very important part. But his phrasing was so right on and so correct that it seems like, it add a dimension of breath that was very, very important. So you have to kind of look at your own dimension, trust your ability to interpret, and also respect the history of other great people who have looked into this thing and interpret it and give us respect. So therefore it becomes a community project in a way, right? So therefore I think that's how you should look at it.
Wonderfully, beautifully put, Phil. So I really like the analogy with music. So in some ways, this is a score. The book is a score, and you have to really interpret it. The interpreters or translators are doing their job of interpreting it, and you also have to do their job, and it has to sing. It has to sing, and it has to try to capture the kind of the glory of the Tao, of nature, of the world, and of yourself. And you judge whether you're doing that, and you see some virtuosos doing something, and your jaw falls and say, wow, that is something, and you try to pick up as much of it as you can and internalize it yourself. So beautifully put. Dave, how do you approach various translations?
I came up with one analogy, and after Phil, I'll talk about the music too. But as Laura was speaking, I was thinking about art, and I was thinking if we had a hillside and a dozen artists and a dozen easels and a dozen canvases, and instruct the artists to draw the sunset, they would have different colors, different proportions, different levels of abstraction, and they would not be identical. But maybe if all these were produced and hung in a gallery, you might say, after I look at all 15, I've got an idea. But I really want to thank you, Shrikant, to expose us to this Eastern philosophy, because I have to admit, I'm skimming, but I think I'm learning a little bit. I really envy the people who have spent years with it. I can say I've spent years with the Christian Bible. I understand some deep things about it. And the other thing about the music, as an amateur musician, I've played the same piece, but directed by two different conductors, completely different interpretation. But I really enjoy listening to the other people read their translations. And I think that's one way I merge in my brain how to understand this, because it's obviously very deep, but as I say, I'm very much enjoying the journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Next up is Brian, Elena, and let's see, I don't know who's next. Evanique. Brian.
So I'm not at all settled on my approach to the interpretation. I have to say, my first, and that's evidenced by the fact that it's even changing as I hear other people talk about how they interpret it. But I have to say, I start out kind of like Shrikant does, because actually I'm looking at the same text that he recommended. I read 4 or 5 of them, and I come up with my own interpretation. And then what I do is, that's from the reading of the translations. And then I hear you all read other translations during the meeting. And I actually understand some of these other translations differently when I hear you read them. And I get more out of them when I hear you read them. And then I get the interpretations from other people. And I think, oh, yes, this, oh, yes, that. The one thing that I do try, and I don't really try to do this, it just occurs to me that each individual poem might relate back to something else. And so I sometimes think back, or I recall something in other poems, and then I try to see if putting the two together, I can't come up with some insight. But yeah, I guess the last thing I would say is I try to imagine the context that he's trying to describe. That's it.
Wonderful. And I want to also point out that actually hearing people read their translations is an amazing experience, because in reading, like, most people actually like the translation that they're reading, and that reading is a performance. It's a great way of that person to communicate that interpretation to you. And I really like the readings that happen here. Elena, what approach are you using multiple translations?
Right, Shrikant. So I just use one. The first one I Google, and this is just, it comes to me because of this is the one that I would use. through, because of the Google search now has pretty much algorithm knowing who I am, where I am, what do I like, what I don't like, what music do I listen, what's the level of my educations and such. So I just trust the search engine and allow it to bring whatever it brings. So this is one thing. So I don't go into multiple translations, but I absolutely love hearing other people, all participants speaking about what they come with, what was their favorite versions, and also reading and interpreting. It's just, it's very individual and it's beautiful. And then one more thing. So all the major figures in the history of religion and philosophy, they never have written anything themselves. They had disciples writing everything down. So there is no specific translation which would be true. Everything is half true. Thank you.
Wonderful. That's a great point, Elena. That's the the question is always, why didn't Jesus write? And that is true for many things. Many people in Indian tradition, many people in Chinese tradition, because partly the oral medium. This is something that we had an entire meetup on with Walter Ong, who has studied, orality and literacy. He's the deepest thinker that I know on that. What happens is that in orality, you're using your body, you're using your gestures, you're using the tone, you're using the emotions. Emotions are coming through. All your words are being worked on through a conversation with the person that you're talking to. You're making sure you're seeing the response of the other person, and you are modifying your words in order to shape that. So the kind of communication you can achieve is so much more than the text. And it's a huge point. Great point, Elena. Thank you. Next up is Madeline. Let's see. Evanik followed by Madeline. Evanik.
Yeah, I think the way I approach it is I have like 4 or 5 translations on my Kindle. And if I'm reading one and I don't connect with it, I move to another translation to see if I can connect with that one. And it's more, it's not so much on an intellectual level as it is a spiritual level. It's like what speaks to me in that moment. And it's also what experience I can bring to it and to have it apply to my life. So sometimes I'll read a translation and I don't get anything out of it, and I'll just move on to the next one and I'll get something out of it. And sometimes I go through all of them and maybe I still don't get anything out of it. And I just have to kind of then either accept that maybe this is not the particular translation for me or particular poem for me, and move on to the next chapter, and then maybe come back to it and maybe it'll speak to me later. But I kind of like approach the Tao like a spiritual book, that it doesn't have to make sense intellectually, but it has to make sense spiritually. So that's the way I approach the different translations.
Evanik, that's a great point. The way I think of it, I use a different terminology. I'm trying to see a pattern in the whole thing. So even when I'm trying to read one of the pieces, I'm trying to see the pattern that is emerging from the whole. I'm trying to kind of go through the text and saying, okay, what is this actually saying about the Tao? So it is kind of trying to have an intuition about the whole and how everything kind of fits together. So that's how I think of it. But I think I really like what you said. Next up is Madeline. Madeline, go ahead.
Yes, I've had this translation, the Jia Fu Feng in Jane English, since the 1970s. To me, the book, it's very simple. It's very straightforward, it's not mysterious, and it's very soothing. And I just keep turning to it from time to time over the years. I think the way other people turn to the Bible. So I started out with it. It had never occurred to me to do any sort of exegesis on it the way we're doing here. And so I started out thinking, okay, so I looked at different translations online, and we had the group first, meeting or two of the group. And then the next time I opened the book and I looked at the chapter we discussed, it was like the air around the page was cluttered with different words, different translations, people's faces, people's voices. I was so annoyed by it because it had I felt like it had ruined this kind of solitary experience of turning to something that was simple and profound and easy to understand. So what I did was I stopped reading other translations. I stick with the one that I have, and I listened to everyone else in the group discuss it because I had never thought of it as a sort of group discussion book, which clearly it is in the countries where it originated. It just isn't done like that here in the West. So I've gotten an enormous amount out of listening to people speak, and especially from the Chinese speakers in the group. Jason and Aman and Kevin and some other people, to hear what the actual flavor of the words would be in the original, because there's some sense in which the whole book is about a flavor that can't be gotten at by the mind. And so anyway, that's how it's working best for me right now. Thanks.
Wonderful. Great observation, Madeline. I think that is the challenge. That is the challenge. You have what you're trying to do is that you're trying to intuitively grasp this in the simplest way possible. So I really liked your description, is that this was like almost like a friend whom you knew, who was speaking to you, and you know everything about the friend. And moment they start to speak, the entire character kind of comes through, and it's very simple and very powerful. And then suddenly there is this cacophony of sounds and things. So I think that it's a very beautiful description of it, because on one hand, we're trying to get to the heart of it. We're trying to put everything together. On the other hand, you're trying to incorporate as much. You're trying to be aware of as much aspects of this world as possible. So I see there is this continuous kind of going back and forth in my mind between relentless drive to kind of integrate things, make things simple, and then going out and exploring and trying to capture more nuances, more connections, figuring out where I might have kind of oversimplified things. So there is this kind of continuous kind of expansion and contraction that goes on at each point. The richness of the concentration keeps increasing. The variety of the kind of exploration keeps on expanding. So it's like a cyclical kind of a motion. And I think doing this with other people is extremely useful, because they bring their rich context in the conversation, and they are generous enough to speak from their heart authentically, and you learn so much. Some things that you would never actually even guess existed, thanks to them kind of opening up and speaking their mind. Next up is Aman. Aman, you had a comment. Go ahead.
I just wanted to respond to Madeline's comment about experiencing this as sort of a solitary exercise like the Bible. You and I were speaking before the Zoom meeting began about some of the religious Taoist orders that exist, and the way those two actually tie in. The Dao De Jing was one of the seminal texts for the very first sect of Taoist religion in China. Zhang Daoling actually had his adherents recite the Dao De Jing as part of a ongoing religious practice for celestial masters. And that lineage, since about the 3rd century, has kept up all the way into the modern day world, where you still have Zhengyi Taoist masters and priests in China and Taiwan who are still chanting the Dao De Jing on a daily basis as part of their practices. And they don't agree on what exactly it means. And they've been doing it for a couple thousand years. So we're all in good company here, I just wanted to say.
Yes. I want to also point out that if you look at the tradition of studying the Bible during the Middle Ages, it was very similar. You know, it was not something that you would just read by yourself. Most of it, most people were not literate. And where was it being read? Mostly in these monasteries where people were reading and actually reading out to each other, writing, discussing it. So this point about conversation as a means, it's like hermeneutics. It's that this loop, feedback loop of not just taking in a book, not just taking in a book and thinking about it, but combining that with speaking it out or writing it out, offering it to other people, them commenting on it, them producing their own version and giving it to you, and going back and forth over that loop, that feedback loop is essential to understand things at a deeper and deeper level. So, so thank you. Laura, what approach are you taking towards translations?
What I was doing after listening to everything and then looking at all of these translations and reading them quickly, kind of, I was trying to look at each one, read through them, find keywords and key ideas, and try and synthesize all of that. And then I found this one translation which seemed to, you know, do it in a very clean and neat way, and very brief kind of phrasing, which I thought made it clean and easy for me. I liked it from a point. Now Phil talks about art. I'm an abstract painter, and so I look for the sort of high, you know, I want to see the geometry. I don't want to see the detail, but I want to see the movement. And so I will look at that. And I think the translation I looked at did that for me, at least at that point. But what I would like to do next is go back and look at all the other translations, because I can see that I can meld them together when I look at the words, because, you know, there are parallels. And see, I like the Tao. It's my new Bible. I never had a Bible, but this is my Bible. And I find, you know, there's something, I can't describe it. It just does something for me. There's some peace and wholesomeness and just something, I don't know what else to say about it for me, but except for this one, this poem just didn't hit me right. But anyway, my way of doing it is this kind of analysis, which is probably a way that I analyze a lot of things.
Thank you, Laura. What is the translation that you like?
This one is by, it's a 1955 translation by a person named Raymond Blakeney.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
That's the one of all of the one. Okay, and you can read it as you wish, but.
Thank you.
Okay.
Next up is Phil, followed by Madeline. Phil.
Yeah, it's important to know that there's also ontological argument. And it really has to do with the fact that Tao that could be known is not the eternal Tao. You know, the word that could be spoken is not the eternal word. So we already know that what could be spoken is a lie. It has to be an interpretation. That interpretation, be it as imperfect it is, it only lives in relationship to a community that passes on to other things. And I think in a funny way, I'm being hypocritical in a sense, that print and leaving something permanent in a sense abuses that temporality that we live in, and that denial of death in a sense. So I mean, I'm as hypocritical as anybody in that sense. And always struck me that in a sense that, you know, that living moment only happens when there is some living conversation about it. I mean, that living inauthentic moment. And so in a funny way, you know, I remember a Roman historian says, you know, time will defeat us all, because eventually our relatives will forget about us, our friends will forget about us, even history will forget about us. Even the carvings that we left, the writing that we carve under the pyramids, the sand will destroy it. Even in a long run, the pyramids itself will disappear, and we will all disappear. So you got to live at the moment of inauthenticity, if I want to put it that way. And living is an important thing. And when you try to deny the impermanence of things about the temporal existence we're in, you are already lying to yourself. Not that we don't all want to lie to ourselves. I mean, I myself included, like, oh my, I want a degree of memory left. So in one sense, so I think what happened is, like, you know, when you're actually talking to other people and seeing what they say as inauthentic it is, that lives. I mean, that's the difference between life and just a stone, right? So
Yes.
That's the point, that you have to understand that despite the inauthenticity, there is an ontology about that existence at that point.
That's excellent. Phil, I call this living ideas. Because the idea is that, you know, it's like the way ideas are. I mean, I kind of I have like two meanings for living ideas. One is that ideas are useless if they are not lived. So you're acting based on the ideas. Otherwise, those ideas have no meaning. Secondly, they're living ideas, in the sense that if you regard ideas as there in the book and as something fixed, then those are not really something that can actually capture the Tao. It cannot capture anything. They are living. And this mode of actually talking about ideas and applying them to your own life, seeing how other people are applying them to their own lives, is an integral part of keeping those ideas alive. Because they can, you know, if you don't pay attention, they die. You know, they very quickly become stultified and ossified, and then they actually are impediments to your life rather than the means for their life.
Well, that's what I mean. When we first met, I say, well, Tao is returning to nature. I said, which nature, right? When you're living the ideas, you are living in the second nature. That's also important to understand, that you are in nature, but the second, if you want to call a Platonic a mere reflection of nature, that's fine. But that is your being, and you know, like the temporality is part of it. And that's why the Japanese love the cherry blossom, because it lives and it fades away.
Thank you. Next up is Madeline.
Yes, thanks, Shrikant. We are the living ideas. I mean, we are the bearers of the living ideas, so to speak. So that was very funny, Phil, because I had just turned back to look at chapter 1 when you were referring to it at the very moment. Because what I think about 13 in terms of which of these things is not like the other ones, what's different about it is that it's much more abstract. Even chapter 1 has mother, desire, something that springs, darkness, whereas this one is about things. It has no body words. It has no senses. It has no actions. It's concerned with a more abstract world of
Madeline,
relationships.
let's keep it brief. We are not going back to chapter 13. We're just talking about translations, the overall things. I want to wrap it up. It's almost 11 o'clock. Go ahead.
Well, you killed the idea.
What? Okay. No. Ideas have to go to sleep. You know, they have to regenerate, and we have to. No, Madeline, we were talking about, because the thing is that I don't want to open up a new topic at the end of the thing. You know, I want to kind of bring it to a close, which is in a much more kind of directed way. So I really like all the comments on the translations and how everybody is approaching translations. It's very valuable. And thank you, Laura, for bringing up those two great points, both about the structure of the of each of the poems and the kind of variety of translations. Really appreciate it. So next time we're going to do 14, as I promised Jason. We did not get to 14, so we will do 14 next time. We have some incredible meetups coming up. We've started a series on Nietzsche. We have this gentleman, Dan, who impersonates Nietzsche, and he answers all the questions as if he was Nietzsche. Nietzsche reincarnated. I have to find a good title for it. So we're doing that on Mondays, and on Thursdays we are studying Bible. It's very interesting to see the kind of commonalities between Dao De Jing and Bible. And on we are starting a series on flow, which is very interesting. So, and I'm hoping to start a series on ascent of man very soon, because that's a kind of pure science. That's really kind of bringing in the context of science, which we have not focused enough on. So, you know, looking forward to all these series. I also want to do a series on kind of highlights of Western thought. So all of that is coming up. We're starting Louis Sullivan's. We are continuing to do Julian Jaynes. So a lot of good stuff, folks, and really appreciate all the comments. It's very rich and very rewarding. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
I think Shakant's going to
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
To create
Bye.
more days in the week, Shakant.